Hello YouTube, welcome back to another Montreal project devlog. This time we're back in the game again, not talking about side stuff. As you can see, I have now some units on the map, so I was working on how to place those. I made some couple changes to the actual project. I got rid of the package for the 2D extras, since I noticed there's a whole bunch of brushes in there that constantly show up here. Some of them are even buggy. I already filed a bug report with Unity, which they were able to confirm, so probably going to fix that real soon. But I also noticed I'm not really using anything in there. I'm not using any of the brushes except for looking into the code and figuring stuff out how they did it. But I have my own brushes. I'm also not using many tiles, only the random tiles. So I just went ahead and where did I actually do that? Here, I wrote my own random tile, which is basically the same implementation with a few tweaks to it. It's basically the same thing. Just put a sprite in there and you're going to be fine. This is actually interesting, this view of the script. Anyway, wrote my own random tiles, redid all the terrain types to reference these new tiles, which are now my own code. Still has the same stuff, color, collider type, and then the different sprites. Now I'm displaying them like this with the Odin thing, which actually makes it a little bit easier since I don't actually have to fill those. I'll show you how that works in a little bit, because it has one attribute that actually looks up the appropriate sprites and fills them in here for me, so I don't have to drag and drop these all in there all constantly. Another thing that I added is in the resources folder. Where's my resources folder? I created one singleton database that contains basically all available terrain types and all unit types. I'm probably going to put that in there to keep a database of all assets of a different type that I need in the code, so I can get easier access to without going resources, find, blah, blah. I just have those in here, and then I'm only going to get access to this one. Now this thing is implemented, I will show you in a bit. And I also created a new brush, as you can see down here. I created a new unit brush. Obviously, there's just one unit available right now. I only added one, but I added unit types, just like terrain types. Panther is now the only one available. I also have some sprites. Well, one sprite now that has this thing. And another thing that I changed is, if you look at the wireframe, I actually changed all the sprites to use a full rect as the mesh type to keep the meshes low poly, since I don't really need a tight mesh. I'm not doing any collision detection or anything like that, so this will be hopefully a little bit more performant. Not sure whether that makes any difference on desktop, but this is one premature optimization that I already made. Anyway, now with the unit brush, I'm basically doing exactly the same thing as I did before. I'm not actually setting the unit on the map. I'm painting a unit type in here. And that is not for gameplay. That is for pre-positioning units. So I'm not going to use that in gameplay to actually move units around, because I think that would not be a great idea. But I need to know where units are positioned the first time the game is loaded. Or loading a new map. So that's how I do that. And as you can see, the unit layer, just like the terrain layer, is then refreshed and checks where units are supposed to be on a map and generates them based on the unit type. It basically generates one of these unit prefabs and then sets the unit type down here, which then updates the sprite renderer and sets the appropriate sprite. Since a unit type, if I go into the script, actually over here, a unit type gets, of course, a sprite assigned to it. This will probably get a whole bunch of other stuff later assigned to it also, like unit starting stats and stuff like that. But for now, it just has a sprite, and the unit layer is responsible to load that. It gets a reference to the unit prefab that it's supposed to load, and then it just sets the unit type on that prefab after it has instantiated it. And if I go to my hex map and I refresh, you can see in the log, probably down here, that it destroyed a whole bunch of objects. See, if I keep refreshing, oh no, it actually checks that it doesn't need to, it keeps, you just don't see that it keeps scrolling here. If I clear the log here and I do a refresh, yeah, there you can see it destroys the units and creates new ones based on the data that it found. So the same thing happens if I load a new map. Old ones get destroyed. If I load the map where I placed the units, they all get put there again. And if I actually delete those and then make a refresh, they should all reappear. Yeah, there we go. So this is just for building maps. This is not something I'm going to use in the gameplay. They're just going to move them around. If I make a save game later, then this might become relevant again, but I'll figure that out when we get there, because I'm probably need to store some additional stuff, like which are actually player units that I need to keep track of, and which are ones that just exist on this specific map. As you can see, deleting also works. It just gets rid of the unit. So that is that. Let me see. Is there anything more interesting in the actual project? I don't think so. So let me jump right into the code. And let's take a look at what I actually did here. There we go. And in the editor, we have the actual brush. Not actually sure whether I'm keeping that in the editor, because not really anything I necessarily need in here. I also got myself a grid brush base, just so I can add additional stuff. I'm adding for now the logger in here, but it might be necessary that these brushes get some additional stuff. So it's basically just another base class, just like component base and asset base. So I now have the unit brush, which is pretty simple. Gets a value drop down of the unit types, but now the interesting thing is it actually gets that from the game database, which I told you has an overview of the unit types and the terrain types. The terrain type brush is now doing exactly the same. It accesses the game database to get the terrain types for that drop down that I see. Otherwise, this is pretty much unchanged, and the unit brush is not doing much different. It does exactly the same as the other brush. Instead of a terrain type, it sets a unit type. So this is a new method on my grid information, which just like set terrain type, I can now set unit type, and it logs everything. And then on the unit layer, it calls refresh position. And that is actually the more important stuff. In the refresh position of that layer, I'm now going to check whether there is a unit on that previous position, which I have a unit lookup for. That is not serialized, that's just on load, because if a new map is loaded, all the units need to be positioned again based on the unit type information stored on the map. Now, whenever I position a unit, I store it. This is just a normal dictionary, doesn't get serialized, so I don't need to do anything with that dictionary. It just exists at runtime. When a map gets loaded, I check whether there is a map, unit on that position already. If so, I set its parent to null. I get rid of it. What this does, I show you in a second, and then I remove it from the lookup. Then I'm checking, is there actually a unit type on that position? Do I have information on the map stored for a unit type? If not, if that is null or something different, then I ignore it. Otherwise, I'm going to create a new instance of my prefab, which with the parent of this thing, I want to have that parented under the unit layer. Then I set the type on it. I give it a new name with the index here. Not sure whether I'm going to keep that, but that's for now working well enough. Give me a second here. My smartphone started a YouTube video again for no reason. And then I'm setting the position based on the cell center. So it's positioned correctly in the local position based on the cell position. This is the cell position that I see when I go in here. This is down there, 0, 0, 0, 1, 0, 2, and so forth. I, of course, need the actual local coordinates relative to my unit layer, which probably has its, where is that actually? Yeah, it has its 0, 0 down there. So from there, we actually need the proper coordinates to position the unit properly. And I'm going to do that with the position here. These unit sprites, those units have their anchor exactly in the middle of the sprite. So if I get the cell center, the unit is automatically positioned correctly. And then I store the unit in the unit lookup so I know there is a unit on that grid position. As I said, this is just a normal dictionary. It doesn't get serialized or anything. Just a vector3 into unit lookup. Also unit index, just so I can name these properly. That's just for debug reasons. That wouldn't really matter otherwise. Just so I see in debug messages which unit we're actually talking about. So that's how that works. It does pretty well, I think. The destroy safely is another thing that I added to the object extensions, actually. I think this is pretty simple what this does. I'm just going to check, is this object already destroyed? Then obviously I'm not going to do anything. Otherwise, I need to do something different depending on whether we're actually in the editor or whether we're actually running the game. So application is playing basically means we're either in play mode or we're actually starting a standalone game, meaning it actually exists in the scene and it's actually used by the Unity in some gameplay. If that's the case, I need to destroy it. If we're just in the editor and we're not in play mode or anything, but this is just some asset that lies around somewhere, or I'm just in the editor, the game object exists in the scene, but the scene is not actually being executed because we're not in play mode, then I can just get rid of it immediately. I don't need to wait for the next frame because there isn't actually any frame in the editor. So this is basically how you can check whether that game is taking part in any runtime execution. If not, you're probably just in edit mode or you're talking about an asset or something like that. And then you can just throw it away immediately. And so I don't have to constantly figure out what I'm supposed to do with it. I just wrote myself a nice little extension method that takes care of this stuff for me. And then I also have an extension on the transform, which allows me to get rid of all of its children. So first of all, it gets rid of all of them, and then I detach them. Because in case they are not actually, I'm not 100% sure why I need to do that. I think because otherwise they would during the frame still be attached until they get actually cleaned up if you do that runtime. So this is something I found that you're supposed to do. If you throw stuff away, you're also supposed to detach it from its parent. So that's that. Nothing super special, just a little making it a little easier to throw stuff away. Then the random tile attribute processor is something that comes with Odin. That is basically making sure, since I'm using a random tile and I derive that from tile, I get all the messed up stuff, all the serialized stuff from tile, and I don't actually want to see all that. The only thing I want to see is color, collider type, and my sprites collection for the collection of sprites that the random tile will choose from. So this is basically going through all the properties that are going to get displayed in the inspector, and I'm checking whether that is actually field, and if so, I'm adding a hide inspector parameter or hide inspector attribute to it if it's not one of these three things. That's just the way that you can control what this gets displayed in the Unity inspector if you're using Odin. Obviously, I could put that hide inspector there on my own, but since I'm deriving from a class that displays stuff, I need to do it like this to get control of the base class stuff. If you want to know how this works in detail, look up inspector processors, attribute processors in the documentation for Odin. So with that out of the way, let's take a look at the singleton asset. Now, there was a YouTube video on Unite, I think, an Unite conference 2 years ago or 3 years ago. I don't remember. It was about scriptable objects and what you can do with them. This is also a scriptable object, just my own base class asset base that derives from it. And this is basically a domain reload, app domain reload safe version of a singleton that doesn't lose all its data in case the domain gets reloaded because you made changes and Unity compiled your DLL. From what I know, it shuts down the app domain, then reloads the assemblies and keeps going in play mode. If that happens, you want the data to still be there, and this is a way to do that. So this is just a singleton instance of my singleton asset. Now, the original implementation in the video made use of this and looked whether there was one there. It did that a little bit different, but the way they use there is now called deprecated in the documentation. So I'm now using resources find objects all of type. That will basically check all loaded assets of this type and figure out whether there is already one in memory. As you can see, loading singleton asset in loaded resources. If I find more than one, then that's the problem already, because then I messed up since this is supposed to be a singleton. So then I'm putting out a warning here. Just a warning because I'm only going to pick the first one. So I'm not going to break anything since I will just ignore the other ones, but there's still a problem. So I'm logging it out. Then I'm checking whether that is actually valid. So whether there was actually anyone in there. If not, then I didn't find one. And then the video went then ahead and just created one. So it basically called whatever scriptable object instance. In this case, I don't want to do that. That would be a different type of singleton that I could just create on the fly. But mine, I want to be not created on the fly, since I want to have this database to have a list of all my assets. So I don't want to create all these lists and then look up everything in that list also. That would also mean that I have to put all the assets that directory references maybe also into the resources folder. I don't want that. If I load this, I want to get all the assets loaded because they're referenced in that thing. So instead, I put that single one in the resource folder and then just look it up. Here I have my folder name where it's located, and it's called the same as its type. So I can just do this, and then I load it from there. If I quickly go back to the Unity editor, you can see it is located in the resources folder under singletons, and it's called the same as its name. Since I want this data pre-filled, I don't want to just create this from scratch, because then these lists would obviously be empty, and then I would have to call some logic to fill these lists. I don't want that. I want to be able to set this stuff in the editor and then keep that when I load it. That's why I'm doing it this way. I'm loading it from the resources folder, then I'm still checking is it valid. Otherwise, we have a problem. We didn't find it. And yeah, that's basically it. That arrow is actually down here. If we found it, then I can just say, okay, found it, got it. That's how I create this database, which I can then just derive from this to make it work. And then I'm also taking advantage of the auto-populate feature from Odin Inspector, which will basically mean it's going to look up all the unit types that actually exist already, and it's going to pre-fill this list for me whenever I go into the editor. It will not necessarily automatically already serialize them back to the asset. If you see that, then it says 0 out of 5 here. You will see them in here, but they're not stored. Then you need to click on refresh here, and then it's going to actually store them back. But I basically don't need to do anything in here. Once I get to this, it will already be there. I think I tried to refill this before, and I made a little mistake here. This is not supposed to be called Woodlands 1. There. Anyhow, in here, I just have the tiles, and in my database, I have my different things here selected. So that helps me with that. And I made use of this autofill feature also in my tiles. If you look in here, these also get pre-filled, but obviously I don't want all sprites in here. I just want some. So if I go in my random tiles, you can see that I'm using a path here. That's the first thing. And then I'm using a custom filter method, which I can specify like this. And in that filter method, I just say, okay, I want everything, every sprite. I'm using a small s here because there is actually a sprite property that Unity already defines. Otherwise, I would call it sprite. I look the name up of the sprite, and then I say, okay, if that sprite contains the name of this tile, then I want them. So that means if the terrain tile is called forest, then I want every sprite that has forest in its name. If I have hills, then I want every sprite with hills in the name. And that gets pre-filled, and then I can just serialize that back, and that way I don't have to do a ton of drag and drop, and it just is going to work. The nice thing about this, especially for the database, is also if I lock this so it stayed open, I can just click on the plus here, and yeah, let's save all this. Then I can just create a new terrain type, and it's automatically going to end up on the list. So I can create a bunch of new terrain types here, but I don't need those, so I can get rid of them. And that also updates the list automatically. So this is pretty easy. If I create new stuff here, let me actually see whether it also works if I create it in here. Where's my terrain types? Probably not. I need to refresh here, but if I create it in the database, it's automatically going to refresh. So that's probably the way to do it. But even if you just click a refresh, it's going to fill it in here. So even that is not a ton of work. You can create 10 new ones here, and you don't need to single drop them all in here. You can just refresh, and everything's going to be fine. And if I add another sprite that has wood in it, it put forest in it, it would also end up in the forest terrain tile. There. That way. So that makes it easy to work with this, and I think that's pretty cool. I'm not going to be 100% sure whether I'm going to keep this game database yet, but for now it's pretty convenient, and it's a thing I want to experiment with, whether this is a good idea. For now it works. If I run into problems, I will of course report about it. So that's the development for now. I have the units on the map. Next thing will be to make them actually usable in gameplay, be able to select them, have some pathfinding, and actually move them around on the map. So that will come up next. Until then, keep your heads up, folks. I'll see you on the next one.